On Friday, September the 27th of 2024, the entire Middle East shifted on its axis. In the span of just moments, in only the time it took for warplanes to drop a barrage of bombs from on high, the leader of the most powerful non-state military organization in the world was eliminated once and for all. His name was Hassan Nasrallah, and up until the moment of his death, he was the leader of an organization known as Hezbollah. Over 32 years of leadership, Nasrallah had built Hezbollah into the fighting force that it was. He had become an arch-nemesis to the nation of Israel, and he had become a powerful symbol in both his home nation of Lebanon and across much of the Middle East. At the time of writing, we already know a part of the impact that Nasrallah will have in death. Iran brought ballistic missiles raining down over Israel in retribution. Several Middle Eastern nations have dedicated multiple days of national mourning in his honor. All across Lebanon, ordinary people with little, if any, connection to Hezbollah wept in the streets, even as others in their nation quietly celebrated Nasrallah's demise. But all of that is Hassan Nasrallah in death. And in today's episode, we're going to examine him in life. From his humble beginnings as a penniless child in Lebanon to his transformation of Hezbollah into a genuinely formidable fighting force to his role as one of the Middle East's most important power players. This was Hassan Nasrallah. Nasrallah's early life was not one that gave him any early advantage, and in fact his experience growing up was very much the opposite. Son of a humble vegetable seller, Nasrallah was among 9 or 10 children in his family, sources vary, growing up in the suburbs of Beirut. His family was Shia Muslim, but not very religious, and the district he grew up in, Karantina, was noted for its poverty above just about anything else. Unlike most of his family, Nasrallah was drawn to religion and theology at an early age, and while he would spend years attending public school in a largely Christian neighborhood, he would continue his personal study into the Shia faith nonetheless. In interviews, Nasrallah would tell of his early desire to become a religious cleric, quoting here, "Ever since I was 9 years old, I had plans for the day when I would start doing this. My grandmother had a scarf. It was black, but a long one. I used to wrap it around my head and say to them that I'm a cleric. You need to pray behind me." When Nasrallah was 15, he and his family were forced, like every other family in Lebanon, to endure a tide far greater than themselves, the Lebanese Civil War, which would continue for 15 years afterwards, see nearly 1 million people flee the country and leave roughly 150,000 dead in its wake. The early years of the Civil War were difficult for Nasrallah, but survivable. He'd finish his public schooling and briefly fall in with the Amal movement, a political party and now former military made up of primarily Shia Muslims in Lebanon. He would attend seminary at an institution loyal to a movement called Dawah. Just to give a brief idea of Dawah, it would lodge its strong support of the Iranian Revolution a couple of years later after Nasrallah began studying its principles. Nasrallah studied in Iraq under the movement's founder, and he reportedly gained favor with the leader, a man named Mohammad Bagher al-Sadr. He also ran in the same circles as one Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who was living in exile in the same city at that time. But Nasrallah would be expelled from Iraq 2 years after he arrived. In 1980, he would receive word that al-Sadr had been tortured severely by the Iraqi regime and executed, with some sources alleging that he was killed by Saddam Hussein personally. By 1982, Nasrallah had become a member of the Amal movement's political core back in Lebanon, making him, at the age of just 22, a bit of a rising star within the party. But in that same year, with the Lebanese Civil War still ongoing, Lebanon would be battered by another oncoming force, Israel. In these days, Israel had been under continuous attack by the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, operating out of southern Lebanon, and gunmen had just attempted to assassinate Israel's ambassador to the UK. The 1982 Lebanon War would be a ruinous affair for the country bearing its name, as Palestinian resistors and Syrian forces would do battle on Lebanese territory, but Nasrallah's connection to the war would come in another way. He was a member of a group that had defected from the Amal movement in support of Ayatollah Khomeini and swore fealty to the ideals of armed resistance under a new name, Hezbollah, the Party of God. With the support of members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, Nasrallah and his comrades in Hezbollah vowed to take up arms and fight back against the Israeli invasion, and once Nasrallah was part of the crew, he didn't look back. Over the following decade, Nasrallah would build a power base inside the Hezbollah movement. Foot soldiers and underbosses who were loyal to him, religious followers who believed in him, and fellow high associates who trusted his judgment. First as a foot soldier, then as a local director, then as a leader in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, and finally in a leadership role in Beirut, his influence and status would swell simultaneously. He would become increasingly enmeshed with Iran, as with the rest of the Hezbollah organization, eventually receiving Iran's backing and aligning itself more closely with Iran's political goals across the Islamic world. In 1989, he traveled to Iran personally to advance his religious studies, and after he returned in 1991, he was firmly entrenched in the inner circle of Hezbollah's leaders. In 1992, the Hezbollah organization was rocked with internal catastrophe. Its leader at the time, Secretary General Abbas al-Massawi, had been selected to guide Hezbollah at a moment of transition as the end of the Iran-Iraq War and the parallel end of the Lebanese civil war meant that the group had an opportunity to shift focus toward resistance activities against Israel while releasing hostages it had taken over the years. But in February of 1992, al-Massawi would be killed by Israeli pilots flying Apache helicopters, destroying a motorcade that carried not just Massawi, but his wife and his 5-year-old son. The assassination had been contentious in Israel, amidst fears that Massawi would be replaced by someone even more extreme, and ultimately those fears would be realized. When Hezbollah turned to the prospect of elevating a new leader to the post of Secretary General, the choice was clear. 2 days after Massawi's death, Hassan Nasrallah became leader of Hezbollah, a position that he would hold for the following 3 decades and more. A man of God, gun, and government, a cross between Ayatollah Khomeini and Che Guevara, an Islamic populist as well as a charismatic guerrilla tactician. That's how one journalist, Robin Wright, no, not the actress, would describe Nasrallah in his heyday. Extreme, inclined toward violent resistance, but possessed of an undeniable political savvy, Nasrallah was a unique leader among his peers. He was a militant, but not quite a strongman. He was a cleric, but not quite a nagging fundamentalist. And he was a pragmatist, but by all accounts neither cold nor unfeeling. But the one thing that Nasrallah would display above all else and keep at the front of his persona during his time leading Hezbollah was an enduring commitment to resistance and struggle against both Israel and what he regarded as a higher and more despicable hidden hand, America. Nasrallah's early years as Hezbollah's leader would be defined by his attempt to settle into balance with his great enemies. After a week-long attack by Israeli forces against Hezbollah, referred to in Lebanon as the 7-Day War, the group's infrastructure was left in shambles, and Nasrallah was forced to accept Israel's terms for peace. But in the following years, Nasrallah would lead Hezbollah in rebuilding, acquiring more dangerous and longer-range rockets and gathering more personnel in advance of the hostilities to come. That fighting would return sooner than later in another Israeli campaign, referred to alternately as the April Aggression and Operation Grapes of Wrath. Hezbollah had been orchestrating a long campaign, launching rockets into northern Israeli cities, and although this Israeli incursion also ended with a ceasefire favorable to Israel, it wouldn't last long. Within months, Hezbollah had returned to its fight, with Nasrallah very much responsible for calling the shots. But in September of 1997, both Hassan Nasrallah's private life and his public persona would change forever. Nasrallah's eldest son, 17-year-old Hadi, was killed in fighting against Israeli forces in southern Lebanon. But although Nasrallah would mourn Hadi's loss, his public response to his son's death would become a turning point, both for Nasrallah personally and for the Hezbollah organization. In a speech thanking God for choosing his son to be a martyr, Nasrallah stunned the Lebanese public, and especially families who had been divided by their younger members' support of Hezbollah, with a display that was taken all across Lebanon as an expression of high selflessness and true dedication to Lebanon's cause. Across the world, much of the international reaction to Nasrallah's speech was one of shock and confusion. After all, how could this brutal terrorist leader so happily see his own son killed? But in Lebanon, Nasrallah's speech was taken a very different way, and it's here that the seeds were planted for Nasrallah's rapid evolution from a militant leader to a local hero. After that, a commonly used moniker for Nasrallah in the Arab world was Abu Hadi, father of Hadi, a deep and visceral reminder of Nasrallah's personal commitment to his people and faith. Despite the pain of Israeli occupation, and despite the immense retribution that Hezbollah brought on itself as it continued to attack Israel with its rockets, the resistance continued. Hezbollah forces would routinely take heavy casualties in their confrontations with the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, but those who survived became savvy operators in combat, comfortable staring down a much more powerful opponent. The group's tactics changed, their ability to wage asymmetric war improved, and before long, Israeli troops were taking heavy casualties in southern Lebanon. Their mission had been to push Hezbollah so far northward that Hezbollah's rockets couldn't touch Israeli population centers, but that had not helped. And in fact, Israel was being degraded more several years into the occupation than it had been at the start. Wondering whether an opposite approach might bring an end to the conflict, Israel, under Prime Minister Ehud Barak, chose to withdraw from southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah pounced. A relatively weak, Christian-dominated Lebanese militia force, the South Lebanon Army, was supposed to keep the peace in Israel's stead. But against the South Lebanon Army, Hezbollah was able to earn a decisive victory. The meaning of Israel's withdrawal and Hezbollah's surge across southern Lebanon was interpreted differently in different corners of the globe. But for Hassan Nasrallah, the only place that mattered was Lebanon and the wider Middle East. And there, the entire region regarded Hezbollah as victorious. For the Middle East at that time, when so many people across the Arab world between so many nations were deeply embittered to Israel and frustrated by its long-proven military might, Hezbollah had done the impossible. They had bled Israel dry, ended its occupation, crushed the Lebanese military force it had tried to prop up, and proved that even with lesser arms, lesser numbers, and so many other disadvantages, an anti-Israel force could really achieve victory. In many parts of the region, Nasrallah himself was elevated to the status of a hero, finally consolidating a reputation he maintained until his death. The next few years would be productive ones for Nasrallah and his movement. In 2004, he would secure the release of the remains of many fallen Hezbollah fighters, including his own son, and in an exchange of living prisoners, he would secure the release of several high-level Hezbollah officials and hundreds of Palestinians in exchange for just one living Israeli and the remains of 3 soldiers. During these years, Nasrallah grew into his role as an orator. As his beard began to show traces of grey, he touted his status as a Sayyid, a cleric whose ancestry could trace directly to the Prophet Muhammad. With his religious influence across Lebanese and international Shia Muslims, Nasrallah began to lean more heavily on ideas of martyrdom and righteous armed jihad. His oratory showed closer and closer links to the guiding philosophies of Iran, and he increasingly referred to both the liberation of Jerusalem and the rhetorical idea of Israel as, quote, a cancerous presence in the Middle East, likening the nation to something that would spread and metastasize unless it was snuffed out. As his rhetoric grew into a tool to justify and explain Hezbollah's actions, his sway across the Arab world became undeniable. As Amal Saad, a Hezbollah expert at Cardiff University interviewed by the New York Times, would explain, quote, he is sort of the physical embodiment of this cause. He sacrificed his son, his whole life. People see him as this heroic, almost mythical figure who embodies all the attributes of justice and liberation. His status translated directly to increased authority to the point that his decisions, and the people he chose to elevate became unquestionable. Those people, by the way, would include a wide range of Islamist leaders who had been part of the Islamic Jihad organization, an older group, when it orchestrated a 1983 series of suicide bombings against both the US Embassy in Beirut and the barracks of American and French peacekeeping soldiers, eventually killing 360 people, including 241 American troops. Nasrallah was shrewd in his decision to elevate those leaders, as well as others who had distinguished themselves in battle against Israel, and give them time and space during relatively peaceful periods to build up the strength of their underlings. All the while, Nasrallah himself led by example, living modestly, publicly attesting that his pay was on the order of a bit over $1,000 each month, and keeping to himself and the social circle of his fellow clerics. He was careful never to represent himself as a higher or more influential cleric than he was, never to speak for international partners like Iran, and never to try and implement or enforce strict Islamic rules. In Hezbollah neighborhoods, there were few restrictions on women's fundamental freedoms in daily life, on public education, or on religious indoctrination. In his public appearances, he was often wry and humorous, and took care to acknowledge and echo the feelings of resentful powerlessness that so many across the Arab world felt about Israel. All the while, he was regarded by both his allies and opponents as a master strategist, a cunning tactician, a shark of a human being when he needed to be, and quite clearly capable of immense violence. But restraint, for Nasrallah, was everything. In the areas Hezbollah controlled, he wasn't a mob godfather or a cartel kingpin. He was the guy who kept the roads clean, who built both religious and secular schools, who ensured that hospitals could function, and saw to it that society ran, at times, a good deal more smoothly than in the rest of Lebanon. And in 2006, Nasrallah would notch yet another victory for Hezbollah, this time in the form of a 34-day war with Israel. After 2 Israeli soldiers had been captured and spirited away back to Lebanon by Hezbollah operatives, Israel had crashed into the country, guns blazing, for hostilities that would leave 121 IDF troops, between 250 and 1,000 Hezbollah fighters, hundreds of civilians from both sides, and 51 foreigners dead. But although Israel got the better of the casualty count and would claim victory when it withdrew, the reality was far more complicated. Hezbollah survived without being substantially diminished, and it had impressed both Arab supporters and Israel adversaries on the battlefield with its fighters' sophisticated training, night vision goggles, and asymmetric warfare tactics. Israel had eventually withdrawn, and what it hoped might happen after the withdrawal, Hezbollah staying out of southern Lebanon and actions by the Lebanese government to dismantle the group, never took place. Nasrallah would take full responsibility for the impact the war had on the people of Lebanon, but outright rejected a resolution by the UN Security Council to disband and disarm. The UN would prove entirely unable to assert its will, and Nasrallah, along with all of Hezbollah, emerged from the crisis with growing support among their base. Nasrallah's relationships with Arab leaders who had been dismayed at his decision to drag the region into another conflict were quickly smoothed over, and on the local level, Nasrallah was responsible for the so-called Green Flood, a massive influx of US dollars that Hezbollah distributed carefully to those who had been hit hardest in the conflict. The aftermath of the 2006 war would put Hassan Nasrallah onto what would be his final path, a long 18-year slog in which Hezbollah was built up not for clashes of a few weeks at a time with Israel, but for the long war and effort Nasrallah believed was necessary in order to encircle and eradicate Israel for good. On a personal level, Nasrallah seemed to change after the 2006 war. Although he had come out of it looking better than he went in, he nonetheless began to take far more stringent measures for his own security. He appeared less and less often in public, eschewed the use of cell phones and other electronics that could be tracked, and traveled more often in secret and under guard. Internationally, his long flirtation with Iran had evolved into a full partnership long ago, and now he and Hezbollah were the foremost members of what Iran would eventually call its axis of resistance. He, and Hezbollah along with him, were in it for the long game. Step one in the long game was about consolidation of power back home. Hezbollah had already won its first seats in the Lebanese cabinet in 2005, and over the coming years, Nasrallah would see to it that the group would exert far greater influence in national politics. Some of that influence would be creeping, more and more victories in parliamentary and local elections, more and more formal and informal alliances with other political movements, and more influence over the levers of civil authority in Lebanon. Some of it would be by isolation and ostracism. For example, Hezbollah and the predominantly Christian Lebanese military would never get along and would instead keep each other mostly at arm's length, other than occasional skirmishes in the streets. And some of that Hezbollah influence in Lebanon would come by force. In May of 2008, after the Lebanese government tried to seize and dismantle Hezbollah telecommunications, the group responded by force, seizing several Sunni Muslim neighborhoods across Beirut and leaving around 100 people dead. The Arab League would eventually have to intervene, and although Hezbollah's reputation took a substantial hit after the group broke its promise never to attack other forces within Lebanon, that wouldn't matter much. By then, Hezbollah was already too strong. It had too much trust from the public, and Hassan Nasrallah could do as he pleased with no real challenge to his authority in the areas of Lebanon that Hezbollah now controlled. If Hezbollah's intention had been to take over Lebanon, then the violence of 2008 would have resulted in a major setback. But that was never the ultimate goal for Nasrallah, and his organization endured nonetheless. After consolidation of its power in Lebanon, step two for Hezbollah was to grow its military capabilities, and in 2011, a perfect opportunity would present itself. That, of course, was the Arab Spring, a wave of pro-democracy protests that led to real change in some nations, stagnation or repression in others, and in a handful, ruinous civil war. And when it came to ruinous civil wars, no Arab Spring nation got it worse than Lebanon's biggest neighbor, Syria. Although Hezbollah and Syria's Assad regime weren't exactly an ideological lockstep, they shared a mutual patron in the more powerful, more wealthy nation of Iran, and for better or worse, a fair proportion of the Syrian civil war would be fought with the help of Hezbollah. For its foot soldiers, Hezbollah's time in Syria was an instructive affair. They would pick up real combat experience in bitter, often gruesome conditions in a war that far exceeded what any Hezbollah member of fighting age had experienced in prior conflicts with Israel. The group would benefit greatly from instruction in foreign tactics and strategy, sometimes by direct instruction via foreign advisors, and sometimes by osmosis, as they served alongside Syrians who had worked with Russian, American, or a range of other international advisors. Some among Hezbollah's number would distinguish themselves in combat, marking themselves as worthwhile trainees for commander positions and bringing their knowledge back home to train others. From there, distinctive elements of Hezbollah's modern military would emerge. The highly trained operatives that today fill the ranks of its Radwan force in southern Lebanon, and the guerrilla-style tactics that the group long expected to rely on in the event of further battles with Israel. And on the home front, Hezbollah would take a full 17 years off from large-scale military engagements with Israel. At Nasrallah's discretion, the group would build its arsenal of missiles and rockets, accepting incredible amounts of ordnance from Iran and other friendly nations by using transshipment routes through Iraq and Syria. As newer technologies became available, they would pivot to acquire precision-guided weapons and then consumer drones that they could weaponize for future battle. Southern Lebanon was transformed into a nest of elaborate tunnel networks, weapons caches, forward defense positions, and hidden command posts. The group's intelligence gathering capabilities became more extensive. Its links to other axis of resistance members grew deep, and its hold on the areas of Lebanon already under its control became even more firm, even as Nasrallah and his underlings got better at hiding the signs of their influence. But Nasrallah's relative absence from the spotlight and a notable lack of the sort of awe-inspiring Hezbollah wins of his earlier tenure had their effects as well. Across the 2010s, Nasrallah's subordinates in politics became more and more embroiled with the graft, corruption, and chaos that defines the modern Lebanese state. In 2019, a wave of public protests against Lebanon's economic collapse and its ruling class lumped Nasrallah in with the other elites who protesters insisted were degrading the entire country. In 2020, when a massive explosion devastated the port of Beirut, Nasrallah was partly responsible for the freezing and eventual wasting away of an inquiry into the groups who were to blame for what had happened. Yet even despite the controversies, never during that time was Nasrallah's place atop Hezbollah ever thought to be in doubt, nor were his ties to and symbiotic relationship with Iran or his deep hold on a large portion of Lebanon's population. He was entirely in command, synonymous with the Hezbollah organization itself, and just as pivotal a presence in the Middle East as the kings, presidents, and ayatollahs that ruled entire nations. Hassan Nasrallah would live to the age of 64, dying on September the 27th, 2024. But the sequence of events that led to his demise would start nearly a year earlier, on October the 8th, 2023. On the prior day, thousands of Hamas militants in Gaza had streamed into Israel and launched a brutal coordinated terror attack, leaving immense destruction and pain in their wake. For Nasrallah and the rest of Hezbollah's leadership, the October 7th attacks presented a difficult choice. They could either show their support to Hamas, a fellow Iran-backed non-state actor in what promised to be a ruinous affair against more militarily powerful Israel, or they could sit back, survive, but abandon a sacred brother to the very enemy Nasrallah and his organization swore to destroy. In the end, Nasrallah would opt for something of a middle road. Although Israel had feared immediately after the October 7th attacks that thousands of Hezbollah fighters and many tens of thousands of rockets would come crashing southward, that mass attack never materialized. Instead, Hezbollah engaged in near-daily skirmishes and rocket exchanges with Israel, launching munitions, sending fighters to engage in gun battles, and generally menacing the Israeli north, but never committing to a full-fledged assault. It was a show of solidarity, and one that brought Hezbollah into an exchange where Israel would respond with airstrikes and raids of its own, but it wasn't enough to drag Hezbollah into a full-scale confrontation on anybody else's terms. But that all changed on the day the pages exploded. On September the 17th, a large-scale Israeli sabotage attack using planted explosives in Hezbollah's handheld pages would kill a dozen people and cause injuries of varying severity to thousands more, taking at least a few hundred Hezbollah fighters out of any future hostilities for good. The pages had been Nasrallah's idea, preferring the low-tech option out of concern that Israeli intelligence could hack cell phones and other electronics. In the following few days, Israel would detonate more hidden booby traps in handheld two-way radios and then unleash a wave of airstrikes that would kill hundreds upon hundreds of people. The strikes ravaged Hezbollah's stores of weapons, its command and control centers, and the ranks of its foot soldiers, spreading mortal terror across much of Lebanon in the process. According to some sources, Hassan Nasrallah was told that his life was in danger. Per Iranian anonymous sources interviewed by Reuters, Nasrallah received urgent word from Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei that Nasrallah should leave immediately for Iran. According to the Ayatollah, Israel had planted operatives within Lebanon and was going to kill him. The Ayatollah's message was sent via envoy, Brigadier General Abbas Nilfreshan, a top general within Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It's not clear what happened when the general arrived, whether Nasrallah had refused to offer to leave or needed time to think about it and get his affairs in order, or whether on the night of September the 27th, 2024, Nasrallah's plan was to leave Hezbollah's central command bunker in Beirut and go straight to whatever airplane, car, or ship was meant to get him out of Lebanon. But in the end, it wouldn't matter. On that night, Nasrallah, General Nilfreshan, and a number of Hezbollah leaders were having a meeting in the dire suburb of Beirut in a bunker 18 meters underground that served as Hezbollah's secret central headquarters. Trapped in their subterranean hideout, Nasrallah and his associates were powerless to stop or even see the Israeli warplanes streaking toward their position. In a brief and devastating attack referred to in Israel as Operation New Order, Israeli F-15s would drop over 80 bombs on Nasrallah's position, including US-made 2,000-pound bombs colloquially referred to as bunker busters. After a brief few hours of uncertainty, Nasrallah's death was confirmed and announced to the world, first by Israel and then by Hezbollah. Despite the intense bombing, Nasrallah's body was found intact with no obvious wounds. Some sources say that he may have suffocated in the bunker, while a majority concur that blunt force trauma from the blasts was likely to blame. According to some sources, Nasrallah's demise would come with a poetic twist. After a life defined by his response to the death of his son, Nasrallah may have died alongside another of his children, his only daughter, Zainab. Nasrallah's death would prompt a range of responses from across the world: celebration across much of Israel, reserved statements of justice served from the US and Europe, concerns about geopolitical implications from China, condemnation from Russia, and several days of mourning in Syria, Iraq, Iran, and elsewhere. Hezbollah vowed to continue its struggle against Israel in honor of its now martyred leader and chose his successor quickly, Nasrallah's longtime second-in-command, Hashem Safieddine, who reportedly survived the bombing and was inside the Hezbollah bunker at the time of Nasrallah's death. Days later, Iran would launch some 200 or more ballistic missiles in an attempt to deliver retribution. That strike would prove only minimally effective. How Hezbollah, Israel, Lebanon, Iran, and the rest of the world react to Nasrallah's death, only time will tell. He was a hated figure across much of the world, reviled, condemned, and regarded as nothing more than a terrorist and a warlord. In other parts, he was exalted, praised as a freedom fighter, and a role model that a new generation of militants should aspire to emulate. But how the competing memories of Nasrallah balance out will take time to establish. With people like him, the impact of both their life and their demise tends to ripple through time long after they're gone. What the memory of Hassan Nasrallah means is a question just beginning to be answered.